We are now moving into our new textbook, which is the one that will be for JavaScript. I'm working with the 6th edition of the textbook, and the assignments that are listed in our course shell are based upon the 6th edition. If you happen to buy the 5th edition, it's nothing to worry about, but I do ask that if you are going to work on the assignments, that you go to the course shell and download the PDF version of the 6th edition, so that you work from that version to do the assignments, just to make sure that everything is in sync. I am going to be going very quickly through the Chapter 1 PowerPoint, which I also have posted here with the topic, so it would be this first PowerPoint. Now, one thing that you'll notice as I bring up the PowerPoint is a lot of the stuff at the beginning of the PowerPoint, like basically the first half or 2/3 of the 57 slides that are there, are total repeat material, because they kind of make the assumption that you might not know anything about web programming, the history of the web, what a browser is, what HTML5 is, all that kind of stuff. So that's what the author does here. So let's very quickly look at these slides. History of the internet. You guys know all that stuff? What browsers are, what web servers are, the different browsers. Yes, NCSA Mosaic was the first. What do we use to make pages? You guys should know that. Teaches you about the basics of HTML, some of the semantic tags, some code, and an example of what it looks like rendered. What tools to use. I think you guys have figured it out by now. One thing that I do want to point out again, when you start working with JavaScript, having a higher end tool might actually benefit you. And I think what might be kind of fun is, as we dig into working on the exercises later, I'll do it in Visual Studio, so you can see how it works in Visual Studio. Some of you might already be using that for intro to programming. And those of you that are in the SharePoint program in particular, that's our tool. Visual Studio is where we will live very heavily. And one of the reasons that these two tools are good is because they do have JavaScript debuggers built in. So if you're typing and you have an error in your code, it'll show you as you're typing it, rather than putting it in the browser and then looking at the console for the output. So it saves a little bit of time. All right, you guys know how to do that stuff. You know HTML5, what it means. You guys remember what XHTML is, right? This is the fastest PowerPoint ever, folks. Client-server architecture. One thing that is important here is the whole concept of how web servers and clients. Remember, the client in terms of web development is always the browser and the machine making the request. The server is what serves up the files. JavaScript executes in the browser, not on the server. Okay, so that's called client-side programming. When you start learning ASP.NET and PHP, that's server-side programming. So it's code that runs on the server. So we're working in the client. Client requests from the server sends back a page, the browser renders it. I think you guys already learned that. There's various different server architectures. That's not really much of a concern at this point. But once again, JavaScript is client-side. All right, we just covered JavaScript history a little bit. Remember when I told you it's really ECMA script? That's the formalized standard, but everybody calls it JavaScript, so that's what we call it. Notice the limitations. Can't be used outside a web browser. Not entirely true, but generally speaking, yes. And it cannot run system commands or execute programs on the client. So I can't, from within JavaScript in my browser, like launch a virus or delete a program or anything like that. It's not capable of doing that. That's by intent. So don't ever fear that you can do that. All you can do is trick people to do it, not actually do it. All right. There are the server-side languages I just mentioned, and here are some. Those of you in the web program will learn 3 of those languages that they list here. SharePoint will learn at least 2 of them and others. All right, so the difference between server-side and client-side, and this is something you'll learn as you go, is that server-side programming, you write code that writes HTML for you. right now you're writing HTML, and that's what you get. But now you're going to, with server-side, you're going to write the code that writes the HTML. See the difference? So really what happens with server-side that's kind of neat is whatever code you write, the user never sees it. JavaScript, though, the user can completely see it. So if you need to keep things private and secure, that's why people use server-side stuff. They can't see your programming logic. They can't steal your code. Well, here they have a rule of thumb. The one rule of thumb is, in terms of taking a workload off of the server, client-side scripting, like JavaScript, is really very beneficial in that capacity because the server's not doing the work, the user's computer is doing the work. And in some cases, that makes for a better user experience because it's faster, it's more responsive. So that's one thing that I always like to point out to people. All right, pretty easy to add JavaScript. We already did a little bit of it, right? You learned about the script tag. You learned that everything is objects. We have procedures and methods, functions. We have certain things. Now, these are programming terms, and I don't know if you guys have learned these things or not. Remember when we had like a function name and it had parentheses after it? Stuff that goes inside those parentheses are usually called properties or arguments or parameters. So something to memorize there for tests, hint, hint. We talked about using the write method in the document object. You've already seen that in action, so I'm not going to repeat it. Here's an example of some document writes. Notice in this case that the author is just hard-coding HTML inside the JavaScript. There's not really much of a functional reason to do it. He's just showing you that you can do that. But if you were doing some special method or if you were doing some decision statement to output HTML based upon, let's say, what the user clicks on, that would be very relevant. JavaScript is case sensitive, so if you create a variable name or something, it needs to be all the same way, otherwise it doesn't recognize it. Now, we learned how to do HTML comments and we learned how to do CSS comments. JavaScript comments work exactly like CSS. For the most part, in CSS, we use these, right? Did you know that you can also use these at the beginning of the line? Nobody ever does, but you can. And that's true in a lot of programming languages. When you guys learn how to do Java and C# and other languages like that, it's all the same type of commenting. So that's something you'll get used to. All right, so they start with variables, and I think we talked about variables. Remember, empty box, when you put stuff in it, give it a name. Now, giving names to variables does have some rules. So this is where we're actually going to kick into a little material here. One thing that you do, keep in mind that you can't use words that are part of the JavaScript language. So for example, JavaScript has a keyword called function, and the other one that you saw was var, right? So I can't call a variable one of those names because it just won't work. So you have to come up with something unique. It's case sensitive, so if it's all lowercase, you always have to use lowercase. Or if one letter is capital, you always have to use it that way. But you have the option where you can also begin with any upper or lowercase letter. You can't start with a number. You can also start with a $sign or an underscore. Okay, so those are interesting. You would say, why would I? Well, there's reasons, because sometimes you intermix languages. So for example, we might use JavaScript in conjunction with PHP, and in PHP, variable names always have a $sign in front of them. So you might be a PHP programmer and you just always think that a $sign precedes a variable, and because you work in that world, you just do it because that way you know it's a variable. Okay, so that's just the why. You can use numbers in a variable name, but it can't start the variable name. It's not allowed. In those spaces, and you can't use reserved words, which we already talked about. So this is a brief list of the JavaScript reserved words. So you can't call anything by these names. And over time, you will learn what most of those do. All right. The ideal way to declare a variable is to use the var keyword. I already clued you in, though, that you can skip it, and it still works. JavaScript is like that. All right. Notice the syntax they're using here. You can actually create a variable and just give it a name, and we saw this in the other book too, that you don't have to give it a value right away. However, you can declare it, as we do here, so a variable, give it a name, and then assign it a value at the same time. And once again, we see that the equal sign is really called the assignment operator. And the convention is that the item on the left receives the value on the right, always. They don't flip, and that's true in every programming language. The thing on the left, whatever variable or object it is, will receive the value of the thing on the right. Okay. So here they're giving an example. This looks very much like what we were doing before, where they were basically combining a string output, which contains HTML, and taking the value of a variable, concatenating it into the mix, and then outputting it so that it looks like this. And this is something we'll get to practice in those assignments. All right. Here they have another example where they're listing a number of variables. So you can see they're declaring a variable called sales total. It's got a numeric amount. It also has another one called shipping. That also has a numeric amount. And once again, I just want to emphasize this for clarity. Unlike a traditional programming language, JavaScript does not formally have you declare the data type. That is unusual for programming languages. Most languages, if I was to use a number that had a decimal point in there, I would say something to the effect of, I wouldn't use var, I would just say double or decimal, usually, or float for a number with a decimal point. And if it was a counting number like this one is, I would say integer or int, the name, and then the value. JavaScript is an oddball. But the cool thing is that it makes it super flexible, and you can actually switch. I mean, you can go from a decimal number to an integer to a string all in the same variable. You can do that. It's kind of odd, not recommended, but you can do that. All right, so we have two of them declared. They each have values. Now we're taking those values. So sales total holds 47.58. You see a little math operator in there. We haven't formally talked about them in this book yet, but we will. And we're adding that to shipping, which is 10. So grand total, which is a new variable we've created, is now 57.58. That's what's stored there. And then we're doing a document write, and we're outputting it, and we're inserting this value by placing the name of the variable inside the statement, and then it will output it as text to the browser. All right. So you're starting to get the pattern of how this is working, and repetition will help you to see it clearly. All right. So you can always change the value of a variable. That's your next point here. So for example, all right. So here they have sales total starts at 47.58, and they output it. That's what you see the first line here. And then they declare shipping, and then they take sales total plus shipping, and this sales total here on the right is the one it was up above. So we're taking that value, adding it to shipping, and then putting it back into sales total. So on this side of the equal sign, sales total is whatever it was before this point. And then after this line, it becomes the combination of those two. And hopefully that makes sense to you. And I always have to remember, some of you have not formally had a programming class yet, so I don't mean to talk in overly simplistic terms, but I have to keep that in mind. Okay, so this might be your first exposure to programming of sorts. All right, so there's a bunch of different ways to build what we call expressions in JavaScript, and there's a number of different tools that we use to put them together. So it says an expression is a literal value or variable or combination of values, variables, and operators. We were already doing it in the previous slides. That when JavaScript evaluates it, will give you something up on the screen. Operands are basically things that allow us to do certain types of combinations. So for example, it says values and literals contained in expression. So for example, in the previous slide, sales total and shipping are operands in the statement, if you want the syntax on it. I guess I don't ever think of them that way. But whenever you hear the word literal in terms of a programming language, that's when you hard code a value. So for example, 47.58 is 47.58 literally. It literally is that number. You see what we mean by that? So when I say it's a literal value, that's the actual value. It's not the variable value. All right. And that can be a string or a number. And then the operators, those are the things that we use to do our mathematical operations and our logical operations, which we kind of looked at a little bit in the previous book. We also have something called events. We also talked about that in the previous book very briefly. We're kind of doing the same thing here again. It is on the brief end of things. But you can see that they show a slightly different list of events and what they do. So for example, they have load. If a document or an image loads, believe it or not, we can trigger an event. So once the document loads, we can have something happen. Or once the image is fully loaded, we can have something happen. That's just an example. Notice here at the bottom, they also have some touch events so that we can deal with touch-enabled devices, both computers, tablets, phones. So you can write events. So in other words, anything that a user does on a screen, you can react to it and write code that does something. All right, next slide here, it says working with elements and events. Events are always attached to some sort of an HTML element or document element. Those event handlers are the little things that will respond specifically and then trigger the JavaScript code. Some elements have certain event handlers available and some don't. So for example, certain form elements will have the ability to react to certain events while other things cannot. So for example, I'm just looking at the list here. So form, input, well, that has a tab index. Okay, here's what I'm looking for. On blur. On blur in a form element is when you have your cursor inside of a field, and then you hit like your tab button, or you click with your mouse and you go to a different field. That's a blur. Okay, you would never know that, but you can't do that with an anchor tag, for example. So that's why it's only attributed to that one. So certain elements can react to certain events. Now, I know that in the previous chapter from the last book, we saw that how jQuery works, so that if we want to use a selector to address an item, they had a really simple little syntax. Well, in regular JavaScript, you don't have that beauty. You have this thing called getElementById, or tag, or class name, and then you can attach to a specific object on the page and then write the code. We'll look at a more detailed version of this as we go along, but this is what allows us to attach JavaScript to particular objects. So JavaScript does have rules, like most programming languages do, in terms of how you structure your code. And here they have a little example of how code can be inserted. In this example, they're putting the script tags right inside the HTML body. And you can do that, and that's absolutely fine. And there's reasons why you might do that. Usually when you want to do a document right and output the HTML right in the position where it should go. That's one reason. All right. Now, another place you can put your HTML tags are in the head section of the document, and we saw that already too. And when you put them up there, the scripts just execute as the page loads. The best practice is considered to take JavaScript, create a separate file like you do with CSS, and then link to it. And usually the link is placed in the head section of the document, but you can also place that link in the body of the document as well. Yeah, why do you want to do that? It really lends well to good clarity between action and content, for sure. All right. Now, we looked at jQuery before, and I'm surprised they really don't list it here. It should be listed here. But very often, people create stuff in JavaScript that they want to reuse. And when you have a whole bunch of things that you want to reuse, you call it a library. And you put it all in one file, typically, or a couple files. And jQuery is not the only library. Here's a couple of others. These are all things that you will learn over the course of being in the program. Node.js, SharePoint people, you're going to learn that in Web 2. And Modernizer. In fact, I think the author in this book uses Modernizer pretty extensively too. That's kind of interesting because basically that's a JavaScript library that allows non-HTML5 browsers to work with HTML5 just fine. It's kind of interesting. All right, you guys have already learned about doing validation, right? So I'm not going to really talk about that. You know where to go to do it. All right. All right, so if you are working with XHTML as opposed to HTML5, and you're using really specific syntax that only works in that environment, this is when you sometimes have to add those like weird comment marks that we talked about, and actually you might even take it a little step further, and I know that somewhere here they probably have an example of it, I'm hoping. Now here's an example. And this is essentially the same kind of thing as those comments, where in order to have it not parse as XHTML or executable or HTML code, you put these comment marks around it, and this is even weirder than the comment marks you saw on the other one, that basically keep it from reading incorrectly. Now, that is usually only in a situation where you're either working directly with an XML file or an XHTML file. So if you're working in that environment, chances are you'll know it, and you'll find out because it won't work. But for regular HTML5 stuff that we do, for the most part, you can typically omit that. The book might not have you do that, and I'm just telling you from a practical sense. I think that's helpful. All right, that really covers all the materials in the chapter. That went pretty quick, thank God. And what we're going to do is, next is we're going to actually work on the exercises in the book. Now, for the exercises in the book, I do want to jump you over to the course shell. And I just want you to be aware of the fact that on the resources page, part of the way down here, you'll see this JavaScript text data files and PowerPoints. So if you want all the PowerPoints all at once, but the data files, that means all the starter files for every one of the exercises are in that zip file. So you download, unzip, pull out the one that you need, and it'll be like hands-on chapter 1. Open that up, and that's what you start with for your homework. Okay, that'll be true for all the exercises in this book. They also probably want to look at the errata document from time to time, and I'm just going to actually open it up right now because we're about to work on these exercises here. Oh, and look at that. There's even stuff right in the first chapter. So on page 38 in step 2, the image element should include the attribute of an ID, because you can probably try to do something to that image, and without the ID tag, it's not going to work. All right? So right away, that's why you look at the errata. Okay? All right, folks, that's it for this video. We're going to take a break and get to work.